My great-great-grandfather, William Henry Harrison Clayton, grew up on a farm. And that's who I was named after, obviously, I guess. But he grew up in a farm in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. He was born in 1840, and he grew up there and lived there until after the Civil War, which, of course, was 1865. He was one of 10 children, six of whom never made it to adulthood. He was also an identical twin with John Clayton. I would assume that my ancestor was the oldest of the twins because they were named after the Whig Party ticket in 1840, the year they were born, which was William Henry Harrison and John Tyler. So I assume he's the oldest because he was named after the presidential candidate as opposed to the vice presidential candidate. But at any rate, he grew up along with his twin brother. They were the youngest of the 10 children. So they were, I guess you could call them the babies of the family. But, his life was pretty typical until the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. What happens, he was 21 at the time the Civil War started. In 1862, he organized a company from Delaware County and along with his brother, became part of the 124th Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment, which was there was a recruitment after the first part of the Civil War where the Union was pretty much getting beat constantly. They had to recruit more soldiers, and so they recruited what they called 9-month regiments. In August of 1862, they were only supposed to serve 9 months, and they volunteered, and I think they got paid bounties or whatever, and that might be one of the things that drove him to organize the company. But he was made lieutenant. He was lieutenant, and his twin brother was a sergeant, and they served for their 9 months. And as luck would have it, their first month of their service, they were involved in the Battle of Antietam, which, of course, was one of the most pivotal battles of the entire Civil War. It was also the bloodiest one day in American history because between 3,500 and 4,000 Americans died in battle that day, fighting each other, of course, but they were all Americans. And that's why it's considered to be America's bloodiest day, September 17th, 1862. And that's after my ancestor had been in the army for about 1 month. 1 month, and he's involved in the bloodiest one day battle in American history. But he served and he was in the battle. He did nothing to disgrace himself or his family. He survived that battle, and he was also involved in battles after that. The 124th was at Fredericksburg. They also were at the Battle of Chancellorsville. That was in May of 1863. That's the battle that occurred right before the Battle of Gettysburg. But at any rate, he was mustered out of the Army after he'd done his 9 months. Although, when Lee invaded Pennsylvania in 1863, they quickly organized another volunteer regiment, which I believe he was also involved with, as like an emergency defense. That happened right around the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. So I don't know what kind of experience he had in the war, but it was not one that permanently injured him either physically or psychologically, because he'd had a very successful career after that. He went to Arkansas after the war, where his brother Pal, who I've talked about in another one of these talks, had achieved quite a bit. He was, promoted to brigadier general, and he married a local Arkansas woman, and he brought his brothers out there with him. Some people call them carpetbaggers, but at the end of the war, things had to change in the South, and if it hadn't been for people like them, God knows what would have happened to some of the newly freed black people who had to function in a society that they really hadn't had much involvement with before. So, in a way, the northern men were there to protect the newly freed slaves. And, I think in that sense, the Claytons distinguished themselves as well. But at any rate, he eventually became the United States District Attorney for the Western District of Arkansas. And that was after that was before Judge Parker was actually appointed, but it was part of a move, I think, on the part of President Ulysses Grant to kind of clean up the Western District. There had been a lot of corruption there, and these people were not people that were the people before Clayton and Parker ended up in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Were not people that were trying to help anybody out. They're just trying to help themselves out by corrupting the federal court in that district. So my ancestor was brought in to clean up the United States Attorney's Office, and Judge Parker was brought in to clean up the court itself. And he was also brought in to establish justice, not only in Arkansas, but in the Indian territories, which the Western District Court had jurisdiction over at that time, because Oklahoma at that time was not a state. It wasn't even a place where a lot of white people lived. It was called the Indian Territories because a lot of the Indian tribes from other parts of the country had been forcibly resettled there, given land which everybody thought was worthless land at the time, and allowed to live in their own, what they considered to be countries. So there were five, what they called the five civilized tribes, which had different areas of the Indian territories allocated, and there were other tribes as well. And there were other parts of Oklahoma, or the territory, that were maybe unoccupied or occupied by roving, the nomadic Indian tribes, the Apaches, Comanches, some of them. That was in the western part, but. The significance is that there was no court system in the Indian territories. There were only tribal courts. So if white people in the Indian territories were involved in some kind of legal dispute, either civil or criminal, there were no courts where they could go to resolve the dispute. And if the white person was committing a crime, that person had no court to be tried in other than the tribal courts. And, I think that's why Congress gave the Western District in Arkansas, gave that court jurisdiction over the entire Indian Territory, which was an enormous geographical territory. It was probably the largest in the history of the federal court system. And it was also full, as time went on, full of criminals, people that would just meander or migrate to the Indian territories, white people, because they knew that there weren't any courts there. There was no established justice system. So they were in there committing all kinds of horrible crimes. And so they brought in Judge Parker to clean up that territory. And he did. Over the course of his terms in office, and I believe Judge Parker served from 1872 to 1896, he became known as the hanging judge. He had the federal court had original jurisdiction over all crimes involving white people occurring in the Indian territories, and that would be crimes where a white person was either a victim or a defendant. And so, the federal court had jurisdiction over murder cases, over basically street crime, that what we would call street crime today, which would be fighting, robbing, kidnapping, raping, murdering, that kind of thing, which the federal courts today really don't have much involvement with. So that all goes to the state courts. But like I said, there were no state courts because Oklahoma was not a state, and the only courts were the tribal courts, and they would only hear cases involving Indian parties or Native American parties on both ends of the suit, either as victim or as litigants. And my ancestor prosecuted, during his time as United States District Attorney, prosecuted, they say 10,000 cases in the Western District of Arkansas, and he prosecuted close to 200 murder cases. He obtained convictions in close to 100 of those cases, and well, convictions meaning, back in those days, if you were convicted of murder under the common law, which is the only law that they had because there were no federal statutes that Judge Parker could use uh, to determine sentences and whatever. They used the common law, and under the common law, there's three possible resolutions in a murder case. It's either convicted of murder, convicted of manslaughter, or acquitted, found not guilty. And back then, the only sentence for murder was the death penalty. If you were convicted of murder, there was no sentencing hearing. You were automatically sentenced to death. And Judge Parker did that quite a bit. And he became, like I said, became known as the hanging judge. He was brought to the Western District to establish justice, and to a certain extent, he did succeed, even though there was still a lot of crime that you couldn't possibly stop all crime in the Indian Territories because it's a huge territory, and the federal marshals were the only people that could go in there and arrest people, and a lot of times you'd have to get witnesses and whatnot. So it was a pretty bad situation, but my ancestor, I think, did a commendable job in prosecuting cases in Judge Parker's court. He was well known as one of the top prosecutors in the West, and he eventually, he was the U.S. District Attorney during all the Republican administrations, and after the Civil War, with one exception, all the presidents were Republican. The only exception was Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat and was elected, I believe it was in 1888. He was president from 1888 till, 1884, I'm sorry, 1884 till 1888. And then he had a non-consecutive term. Remember, Grover Cleveland, the only president to be elected to non-consecutive terms from 1892 to 1896. So, my ancestor was not the U.S. District Attorney then because, of course, it's all political, and he was a Republican, and Cleveland would appoint Democrats when he became president. But during his time out of office, W.H.H. Clayton was also pretty successful as a defense attorney. He was involved in some major cases in Judge Parker's court, representing people charged with murder. One of the most notable people who he represented for a murder in front of Judge Parker was a U.S. Marshal named Bass Reeves, who was famous for being probably the first black marshal in the Indian Territories. And Bass Reeves is, he's a historical figure as well. So I don't have much to add to what's out there, but I do know that he worked very closely with my ancestor when my ancestor was in the United States Attorney's Office. And Bass Reeves was known as one of the marshals who could bring in the most prisoners. He was very good at his job. Unfortunately, there was an incident, and the way they used to do it back then was the marshals would go out with the whole posse, and then they would round up all the criminals they could find. They had warrants, and they would have a posse with them, and that would include cooks and people to take care of the horses and whatever. And there was an incident where Bass Reeves' posse cook was shot by Bass, and the circumstances were a little murky, but he was never charged until after my ancestor left the United States Attorney's Office and the Democrats took over. The Democrats back then were, of course, the party of the Confederacy, and as party of the Confederacy, they were also pretty racist. And so they didn't like the fact that Bass Reeves was a black marshal, and they wanted to get rid of him through jealousy or whatever, or just pure hatred. And they brought up these charges from 2 or 3 years ago, and all of a sudden he ends up being prosecuted for murdering the posse cook that had died while they were out in the Indian Territory. My ancestor represented him, but this was in front of Judge Parker, which must have been pretty interesting because Judge Parker had actually appointed Bass Reeves as the first black U.S. Marshal. So maybe the fix was in, who knows? But, I don't think anybody ever accused Judge Parker of corruption, but Judge Parker had a lot of discretion about how he could charge juries and what he could really influence trials. I've seen instances where he would usually do that for the prosecution, but I would imagine that maybe he was doing that for the defense in the Bass Reeves trial. And my ancestor also had a pretty close relationship with Judge Parker. So Bass Reeves knew what he was doing when he hired W.H.H. Clayton to represent him in his murder trial. And things worked out for him, as best they could. He was acquitted of murder, although I'm sure nobody wants to have to go through a murder trial in front of the hanging judge. But that was one of the most significant verdicts that my ancestor was involved with. And he also represented, there was another famous case involving Native American of the Cherokee tribe named Bowden now. That was a very well-known family back then in the Cherokee Nation. And he was accused of murder in the Cherokee Nation, and my ancestor represented him. And the Boonenows had resources, and Bass Reeves did too, for that matter, because he did quite well as a U.S. Marshal, so he was able to pay legal fees for good attorneys. And the Boonenows not only hired my ancestor, but I hired several other attorneys. It was a very famous trial at the time. Once again, an acquittal though, and that happened right before the 1888 election when President Harrison won, Benjamin Harrison, and the Republicans were back in control again, and eventually my ancestor was reappointed to his U.S. District Attorney spot. And he continued in that, and eventually he was appointed to a federal judgeship in the Indian Territories, which, as the years went on, Congress had started establishing federal courts in the what eventually became the state of Oklahoma. And things were changing quite quickly back then. And there was a lot of controversy about Judge Parker and his hanging judge reputation. And I think they wanted to take away some of his jurisdiction. Also, there were a lot more white people moving into the Oklahoma, what eventually became Oklahoma, and into the Indian Territory areas. And some of the land, of course, seems to be a common theme in American history, was taken away from the Native Americans. And the federal courts eventually were established in Oklahoma. And my ancestor was one of the first judges appointed, and that would have been in the Choctaw Nation, which was McAllister, Oklahoma, and that's where my grandfather grew up. In fact, my dad grew up in McAllister too, in McAllister, Oklahoma. So by the time his life was over, William Henry Harrison Clayton had done a lot, and I think he'd done a lot of good. It's easy, to think maybe he was just a hack, political hack who got appointed by his brother, or was, achieved his appointment because of his brother. But I don't think you stay a United States attorney for that long and not being a very good attorney. And, he achieved success as a defense attorney. And I've read some of his opinions as a judge, and, they were not written by a hack. I think, you could, as a lawyer myself, I could tell that he had a very trained legal mind, and I think he was trying his best to be a fair judge. And he also had 8 kids, so I have a lot of cousins out there, and his twin brother had 7. So between the two of them, there's 15 kids, and 3 or 4 generations later, there's probably a lot of us who related to those guys. But his house is now a National Historical Monument. It's called the W.H.H. Clayton House, and that's in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And I've been there, and I've actually, given some money to the house because I think it's important. And they have a whole historical district in Fort Smith, which basically has remained intact since the late 19th century when Fort Smith, the hanging judge was in his heyday. Um, and I think it's a good legacy that W.H.H. Clayton left, and as his descendant, I'm trying my best to carry on his legacy.